On February 24th, 1983, a 21-year-old man named Don Decker walked into a funeral home in the tiny rural town of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where Don's grandfather's funeral was being held. And as soon as Don walked inside, he saw his grandfather's casket open for viewing at the front of the room, and then he also saw lots of his family members and friends of his grandfather kind of kneeled around the casket and, sitting in the front seats of this funeral home, and everybody is quietly crying and kind of consoling each other. But Don, he walks in and he doesn't talk to anybody in his family, doesn't talk to any of the friends, he doesn't go up to his grandfather's casket. Instead, Don sat down in the very last row of seats, he folded his arms, and just scowled angrily as he looked around the room. Unlike everybody else inside of this funeral home, Don was not remotely sad. He was instead just totally angry. In fact, as he was sitting there, he was clenching his fists so hard out of fury that his fingernails were practically cutting into his skin. Don had come to this funeral home directly from the Monroe County Correctional Facility, where he was serving a 4 to 12 month sentence for receiving stolen property. The jail had granted Don a furlough, which is a temporary leave of absence, so he could go to his grandfather's funeral. And Don had jumped at the opportunity, mostly just to get out of jail for a minute, but now that he was actually at the funeral, he kind of regretted going. Eventually, the actual funeral began, and one by one, Don's family members would go up to the podium and say something nice about the grandfather, and then sit back down. And at first, Don, he put up with it, but after a couple people had spoken, Don was just livid. He just couldn't hear any more. And so he tried to focus his attention just on his grandfather's casket, where he could literally see his grandfather's face as he was laying there. And as he was staring at his grandfather's face, suddenly Don saw something and he stood up really suddenly in his seat. And in fact, when he stood up, it immediately caught the attention of the speaker, which was Don's cousin, and the cousin just stopped and stared at Don. And at that point, the rest of the people in the funeral also turned around and looked at Don, and Don, he knew people were looking at him, but he didn't care anymore. He was now so focused on his grandfather because a second ago, he could have sworn he saw his grandfather's lips moving like he was still alive. But as Don continued to stare at his grandfather, expecting his lips to move again, they didn't, and so finally Don didn't say a word to all these people who were still staring at him, and he just turned and stalked out of the funeral home. Once Don was outside, he thought for a second about heading to the home where he knew his whole family would be going after the funeral, but Don just could not face being around that crowd again, and so instead, he headed to his friend's home. It was this couple named Bob and Jeannie Kiefer, and the reason Don wanted to see them is he knew they were just kind of laid-back people who would not ask him a lot of questions, and they would just kind of let him have some peace and quiet. And really all Don wanted between now and 2 days from now, when he had to go back to jail when his furlough ended, was just to have some peace and quiet. And so Don made his way to their house, and when he got there, Bob and Jeannie were so excited to see him. They called him inside and said, hey, we're going to make dinner, go wash up and relax, and we'll eat together. Don didn't say much, but, he nodded a thank you, he went inside, and right away he went upstairs to the bathroom and splashed some cold water on his face because still, Don just could not shake that anger he was feeling when he was inside the funeral home. And for a second, the splashing of water on his face seemed to be working. He felt like his whole body was getting cooler. In fact, the whole bathroom seemed to have this coolness descend on it. But a weird thing started to happen. Don, as he's feeling this kind of cool come over him, he realized it was actually getting so cold in the bathroom, literally, like physically cold in the bathroom, that it was becoming uncomfortable, like he was cold. And then when Don just happened to look up at the mirror right in front of him, he could have sworn for a second he saw on the edge of the mirror the face of an old man wearing a gold crown. And immediately Don, he kind of freaked out and turned around, but there was nothing there. And as he's like shivering from the cold from being in this bathroom, he began looking all around him, trying to find this old man with a crown on his head, but obviously there was nothing in the bathroom with him. And so Don felt totally unsettled by this. He didn't understand why it was so cold. He didn't know what he had just seen. And then Don happened to look down at his wrists, and he saw there were these deep scratches all over both of his wrists. And so kind of in a panic, Don just rolled his sleeves down to cover up whatever was on his wrists. He didn't want to think about it. He turned off the water and sprinted out of that freezing cold bathroom and just made his way downstairs where Bob and Jeannie Jeannie were just sitting down for dinner. So Don, he took his seat, he got his food, and he didn't tell Bob or Jeannie about anything that had just happened up in the bathroom. He just sat there and ate in silence. Now, Bob and Jeannie could clearly tell something was on Don's mind, but they'd known him for years, and they knew he was just not the type to come out and talk about anything personal. He basically completely kept to himself, and then when he spoke, he was kind of oddly flat and monotone and emotionless. That was just who he was. But, he didn't cause any problems. He was a very nice guy. And so for this entire meal, Bob and Jeannie just kind of looked at Don, but didn't ask him any questions and just let him eat in peace. After the trio was done eating, Jeannie gathered up their dishes and headed to the kitchen to wash up, and Bob and Don headed to the living room where they sat down and Bob turned on the TV, and for a few minutes the two friends just watched TV. But at some point, Bob realized when he looked over at Don that Don was not really looking at the TV. He was actually looking down at the ground. It was like he was just sitting there motionless, just staring off into space. And Bob thought to himself, wow, Don must be catatonic with grief here from losing his grandfather. But Bob, he felt really bad for Don, but he had no idea what to say to him. He knew Don was not about to launch into some deep story about how he was feeling. And so Bob just sat there and said nothing, hoping that, just his physical presence next to Don was comforting in some way to Don during this really difficult time. And so a few minutes goes by and the two men are still silently sitting in their seats when Bob begins to hear what sounds like running water. And at first, he looked over at Don, thinking maybe Don had spilled a drink on the ground, but Don didn't have a drink. Don was still just sitting there catatonic, staring at the ground in front of him. And then, Bobby turned and looked towards the kitchen, thinking maybe Jeannie had spilled a drink, but she didn't appear to have done that. And then Bob felt a drop of water land on his head. And so he looked up and he saw water was coming through the ceiling. And so right away, Bob stood up and he yelled to his wife that a pipe had burst. And then Bob, he grabbed his phone and he called his landlord who lived right nearby and said, you got to get over here. There's a pipe that's burst in your house. And just a couple of minutes later, the landlord and his wife arrived at the house. The landlord ran inside and he and Bob rushed upstairs to try to find the origin of this leak. And when they got up there, they looked everywhere and there was no obvious sign of where water could be leaking from. The toilet wasn't overflowing, neither was the sink. They couldn't hear the sound of running water anywhere. And then they also realized as they're walking around upstairs that where the leak was coming through the ceiling above the living room, they went to that rough area above the living room. And the landlord was like, there's no plumbing over this area. There should be absolutely no water anywhere near where the water was coming through. And so Bob and the landlord were very confused and they began walking downstairs to try to figure out what else they could do. And when they walked downstairs, two things happened very quickly. The first was, as they came down the stairs, they were entering the living room where the leak had originally been noticed. And when they walked back into the living room, they saw right away that this leak had grown, and it was now not just coming out of the ceiling of the living room, but it was also now leaking out of the walls of the living room. Basically, all the different walls and surfaces in the living room were leaking water. And then the second thing they noticed was Dawn. Dawn was still sitting on the couch, still just totally catatonic, staring at the ground, not doing anything, which made no sense. Everybody else in the house is running around trying to figure out this leak, and there's Dawn just staring at the ground. And so Bob, who at this point is pretty overwhelmed with what's happening here, but he thought, I gotta make sure Dawn's okay. And so he just walked through the leaking living room right over to Dawn, and he said, Dawn, are you okay? And Dawn, he didn't say anything, he didn't move, but his mouth kind of contorted into this weird smile with his lips kind of pulling away from his teeth, and all the tendons on the top of his hands began to tense as he wiggled his fingers. And Bob, at this point, he realized there's something wrong with Dawn, and they needed to call the police. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I got out of the military in 2017, it was one of the most difficult times in my life. Now, on paper, I was sort of like the best version of myself. I had just retired from the Navy SEAL teams, something I was very proud of, and I had this beautiful young family. But transitioning back into the civilian world was terrible for me. I was depressed, I was unemployed, and I was too ashamed to tell anyone, and so day by day, it was like I just spiraled and got worse and worse and worse. But luckily, my family noticed how badly I was doing, and they gently encouraged me to seek out professional help, to go see a therapist. And I did. I can honestly say I think that saved my life. I was going down a very dark path when I did finally reach out and get help. And so now I can honestly say I am the best version of myself today, and that's largely because of therapy. Now, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're struggling right now, therapy is a really good starting point. And a very accessible therapy option is BetterHelp. They're on a mission to make starting therapy easier, which is why they're entirely online. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire online, and then you'll be matched up with a BetterHelp therapist in as little as a couple of days. And if you don't click with your therapist, it's no issue. You can easily swap for another one at no additional cost. If you're struggling and you think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the story. Two police officers named John Bojan and Richard Wolbert arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house. And so they came inside, and Bob quickly tried to explain what was going on. But John and Richard, they walked inside and immediately saw, okay, something totally weird is happening here. Because they looked into the living room and they saw water coming down from the ceiling, coming out of the walls. It was even bubbling up all over the floor. And in the middle of all this chaos was one person, Don, who's just sitting there totally erect, not moving, wiggling his fingers with this weird expression on his face. And the police very quickly said to Bob that we don't know what this is. We don't even know how to help. So we're going to get our police chief. And as soon as those officers left, it was like Bob, Jeannie, the landlord, the landlord's wife, they were now scared to be in this house. Before, it was just baffling. But now with Don sitting there tapping his fingers with that weird grimace on his face and water coming out of everywhere for no reason, it was like terrifying. And so the four of them just kind of huddled in the dining room staring at Dawn and the living room until finally the two officers came back with their police chief. But once the chief came inside, things did not get any better because the chief walked inside and he saw how totally weird this was. But his reaction was, this is not a police problem. You clearly have some sort of totally weird plumbing issue that seems very extensive, and your friend, he seems okay, he's just acting really weird. And so the chief told his two officers, John and Richard, to not talk about what they saw in this house and just leave, don't report it, get out of here, we're done with this. And just like that, John, Richard, the police chief, they said, okay guys, your problem, and they left. And then Bob and Jeannie's landlord was like, okay, we're gonna get a plumber over here right away, and you can deal with this. And then they left. And so Bob and Jeannie at this point are totally unsettled, and they just stood in the dining room staring over at the living room where Don was just sitting there tapping his fingers, water's leaking all around him. And then finally a plumber came to the house and they searched the whole house and they could not find anywhere where there was a leak. It literally didn't make sense that the living room was still leaking water. And so Bob, he contacted his landlord and said, what do you want me to do? And the landlord said, you know what? I don't know. We'll send out more plumbers tomorrow. We'll figure it out. And so Bob and Jeannie, they just put out as many towels and blankets as they could all over the living room, doing their best to kind of sop up the water. The whole time they're glancing over at Don, who's still not moving, tapping his fingers, sitting on the couch. And then finally, after Bob and Jeannie had exhausted their towel and blanket supply trying to sop up all this water, they're like, what can we even do? It's still leaking. We can't stop it. We don't know what's going on with Don. And so the couple just sat in the dining room staring into the living room, basically at Don, just kind of waiting for him to maybe break out of his trance. And eventually Don would, break out of his trance, kind of. Instead of, suddenly standing up and talking to Bob and Jeannie, he just eventually kind of dozed off, still in the upright sitting position. And so at this point, Bob walked over to Don just to check on him and make sure he was breathing and that he was okay. And so he checked and, he was, Don was okay. But Bob noticed that on Don's neck were all these dark red scratches and marks, like someone had been strangling him. And then also on the inside of Don's collar was a little bit of blood. And so Bob, he calls over Jeannie and he's like, what do you make of this? And she's like, I don't know. This whole thing, I don't know what's going on here. And so the couple decided they would just go to bed. Don seems like he's okay. He's sleeping on the couch. We can't fix the water, so that's all we can do. And so the couple, they went upstairs, they went to bed, and the next morning when they came back down, the living room was still leaking, and Don was wide awake again, back in that sitting position, tapping his fingers with this bizarre grimace on his face. And all day that day, and all day the next day, that's where Don would stay, in that position, only stopping to fall asleep, still in that position. And over those 2 days, all these plumbers and different people came over the house, and nobody could figure out where this leak was coming from. And so the water just continued to pool inside of the living room. And then finally, on February 26th, so 2 days after Don had arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house, Don suddenly stood up. He didn't say a word to Bob or Jeannie. He just walked out of the house. And as soon as he did, all the water that was leaking out of the ceiling and the walls stopped. Don would go back to prison, and when he walked into his cell, his cellmate took one look at Don, and apparently the look on Don's face was so unsettling that the cellmate immediately called over one of the guards and said, "You gotta get me out of the cell. I can't be in here with this guy." And so this cellmate and the guard, they both turned and looked at Don, and Don, he was at the back of the cell and he was facing both of them. And when they looked at Don, that totally weird grimace came across his face, the same one he had on as he sat in Bob and Jeannie's house for those 2 days. It was the same expression, and with that expression on his face, in this totally creepy kind of hollow voice, he says to the two men, "I can make it rain." Now, the cellmate was terrified of Don and was practically screaming for the guard to let him leave the cell, but the guard, who was definitely unsettled by Don and his behavior, he was less scared and more just kind of intrigued with what Don had just said. And he said, "Okay, hey Don, if you can make it rain, then why don't you make it rain in the warden's office?" And after the guard said this, Don's expression, that kind of creepy, weird smile he had, it grew larger and larger until he had this totally bizarre smile on his face, exposing all of his teeth. At this point, the guard now felt totally terrified of Don and understood why the cellmate was so scared of him. And kind of instinctively, the guard just turned and ran into the warden's office to tell the warden what was going on with this guy. But when he got into the warden's office, he looked at the warden, Dave Keenhold was his name, and he was sitting at his desk doing some paperwork, and Dave looked up at the guard, and the guard realized on Dave's chest, his shirt, there was this wet spot that was growing slowly all over his chest, and it was almost like the warden didn't realize it was happening. And so Dave looks up at the guard and he's like, what's going on? And the guard, he just points at Dave's chest and says, look! And so the guard told the warden about what he had just witnessed in the jail cell and how he had kind of jokingly told Don to make it rain in the warden's office, and now there's this wet patch on your shirt, what's going on here? And the warden, he looked down and he was just as caught off guard by this wet spot on his shirt. And so he leapt up and he and the guard ran back to Don's jail cell. And when they got there, they couldn't believe what they saw. Water was pouring out of the ceiling. It was coming out of the ground. Even the bars were leaking water. And there was Don in the back of the cell, standing there with that terrible smile on his face, and his fingers were contorting. All the tendons were all tight in his hand. And his cellmate was practically crying, huddled in the corner. And so right away, Warden Keenhold moved the cellmate out of that cell, put him in another cell, and then shut the cell where Don was. And then the warden called a plumber to come out here and stop this leak from wherever it was coming from. But the plumber came to the jail, and no matter where he looked, he could not find anything that would cause this leak inside of this jail cell. It just didn't make sense. And in fact, the plumber was so scared of Don, who the whole time this inspection is happening, he's standing in the back, wiggling his fingers with this bizarre look on his face. The plumber was so scared of Don that after he told the warden that he couldn't find a leak, he just left without even being paid. He just had to get away from Don. Now, Warden Keenhold had no idea what was happening with Don, but he could tell it was well beyond his own expertise, and frankly, he had no idea who he should call about what was going on. And so he just called the jail's minister and asked him to come over and see what was going on. But when the Reverend got there and saw Don and saw all the water in the cell, he too had no idea what to do. But when the Reverend walked up to the bars to get a closer look at Don began to move in the cell as well towards the Reverend. And Don, he would stop about halfway through the cell, and when he did, the Reverend stopped as well, and they were kind of looking at each other. And then Don, he raised up his right arm into the air. And when he did, more and more water began pouring into the cell, and also this terrible rotting smell filled the entire jail. It smelled like death. And the Reverend, he was horrified by it, and Don, he was just grinning with his arm up, and then he brought his arm down and began rubbing his hands together and just staring at the Reverend. At this point, the Reverend grabbed his Bible and began reading passages accusing Don of being possessed by Satan, and he was reading all these passages from the Bible to try to banish this evil spirit from Don. And then suddenly Don just let out this horrible guttural scream that was so loud, the Reverend had to stop and cover his ears, and so did the warden and the guard and the cellmate. cellmate. And then after he let out this horrible scream, it was like Dawn snapped back to reality and he just collapsed on the ground and began sobbing. It would take Dawn a long time to finally open up about what the heck had just happened to him, but he would eventually open up to his friends Bob and Jeannie. And while his explanation for what he went through did explain some aspects of what occurred between February 24th and 26th of 1983, it did not explain everything. Dawn and his grandfather had been very close. However, when Dawn was just 7 years old, his grandfather began abusing him physically. Dawn had kept the violence a secret for his entire life, but he had come to view his grandfather as the human embodiment of evil. And so when his grandfather passed away, Dawn frankly was relieved to find out his grandfather was dead. But when he went to the funeral and he saw all of his loved ones talking about his grandfather as being this incredible person, so loving, so kind, it totally infuriated Dawn. And as he felt this anger growing inside of him, Dawn could have sworn he saw his dead grandfather's lips move. And at the time, Dawn had no idea what to make of it, but he would later say that he believes that was the moment that his evil grandfather's spirit basically possessed him. And Dawn would say when he got to Bob and Jeannie's house, he began to feel like there was something wrong with him, but he couldn't stop whatever it was. It was like there was somebody else in his brain making him do and say things that he didn't want to do, but he just couldn't stop it. And so he had gone upstairs to the bathroom in Bob and Jeannie's house, hoping to splash some water on his face and make himself feel better. And that was when he saw that old man's face. Well, that face was his grandfather's face. He was wearing that crown. And Dawn would say he thinks the reason he was wearing a crown is because it signified he had all the power over Dawn. And then also Dawn had those scratches on his wrists, which he thought was his grandfather as well. He went downstairs and tried to tell himself that everything was okay. But after Dawn sat down on the couch, he said he couldn't move anymore. It was like his grandfather had totally took over, and he locked him on the couch with that bizarre contorted expression, and he kept moving Dawn's hands around. And then obviously the water began leaking in the room for no reason, which Dawn says was entirely his grandfather. He was just trying to scare all of Dawn's friends and Dawn himself. It was his way of tormenting Dawn a little bit more. And then again at the jail, when the same scene kind of unfolded, Dawn believed it was his evil grandfather inflicting just a little bit more pain and torment. For almost a decade after this happened, everybody involved in this didn't really talk about it publicly, especially the police and the jailers. They did not talk about what they witnessed because they were worried talking about it publicly would make them look like crazy people and they'd get fired. But eventually in the 90s, 9 people, including 4 police officers and the jail warden, would officially go on the record and testify to what they saw happening. And it would include Dawn seeming totally deranged and in a trance-like state as water just poured into these rooms that he was in. To this day, we do not have an explanation for what happened to Dawn. The only explanation that seems to make sense is that Dawn really was possessed by his evil grandfather. Also, it should be noted that Dawn never made it rain again. The only times that happened were in Bob and Jeannie's house and in that jail cell from February 24th to February 26th, 1983. After that, Dawn lived a totally normal life.
On the night of July 24th, 1987, 30-year-old Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hico, located in central Texas, along with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. And the 3 of them were standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay here or leave. Now, as they're standing there, they can hear people having fun on all the rides. There's kids laughing and they're screaming. I mean, it's a Friday night. They had chosen to come here. This was the activity. But, so far the night had really not been that great. So Susan's best friend, whose name was Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, whose name was Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them and come to this fair because Susan's life of late had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of this very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she was dating had sort of wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so, Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyways, were sort of in rough shape. And so Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and just at least for one night, come enjoy this fair. Just forget about everything else and just come have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, sort of ironically, Once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around and playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at the fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that they weren't really having a good time, that they were feeling kind of bad. Cindy said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio is, standing at the gate, wondering if it's even worth staying here any longer. And ultimately, Roy finally just said, you know what, why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too. And he said, why don't we go back to Stephenville and we'll just drive around for a bit and eventually we'll go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and we'll get some ice cream. And when Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought that was a great idea. And so they left, they hopped in Roy's truck, and they began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away, and so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having kind of a great night, the first in a long time it felt like. The last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February, taking her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected, and he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce, and then instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex and all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped kind of pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends, and a lot of close cousins. And so she had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. She just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life, it's turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table, and without saying anything, she walked up to the counter, and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. And when she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised, and were kind of impressed even. Which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like, you know what? I have been set free. I'm just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend. Because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked, and then all day Sunday, she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry, she had made the bed, and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband, Michael, had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house, like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy, and Susan by this point believed she had found, almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet, and then go to bed, because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there, flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. Two days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days, and nobody could get a hold of her. And so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit and he poked his head inside and he called his daughter's name. But he didn't get a response. So he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something is wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. And his daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then, when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then, it's like he broke out of his fog, he stumbled backwards, he ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, hey, what are you doing here? But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter, and based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands, and then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work, by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume, and so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable. Except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here, because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor, and there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress, and also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub, with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead, because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. I mean, this had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake, because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints, almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office, where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages. But he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed, it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died, although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a door frame to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case, so everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this. not only because, he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work, so there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. Two days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit, as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help, scanning the mourners, through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing, and Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis, and word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis, and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis, which meant that, as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another, better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases, while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet, and Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be, given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file, and then after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory, and so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee, and then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer, and she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitars shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bauman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C. story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bauman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay, but J.C. he got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of JC. So he decided to push pretty early and see how JC reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked JC where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered, based primarily on the autopsy report. And when JC was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make JC look that good. So Hensley asked JC if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, JC, had pressured her for sex. JC turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that JC was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel JC to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first. But he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, JC said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints." And he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had JC's finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog, so his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait, because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for two reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And two, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan. And Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut, so he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, okay, let's hear your theories. And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th?" And Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised, as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty. Because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons & Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons & Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints? And Roy said, yeah. A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd matched the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect, or more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed, that's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally unverified. Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime, so Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out, and at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement. Because through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS crime lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspect's fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table, and as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bauman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael, because Michael is this estranged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke and he smoked cigarettes, just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these 3 men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion, and finally just total disbelief, because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father Joe, his friend, some closure. But now, he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired, and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes, he studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone, and he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown prints against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print, so the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here, but he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26, 1987. Stephenville's Main Street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts, and as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away, so the killer stayed half drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram, and then the killer stripped off their clothes, they stretched out on the floor, and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now, the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then, but now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her. But Susan immediately pulled back, suddenly angry. The killer grabbed her, and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years, but that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, and he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley, and just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the round table, and Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so on June 7, 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons, and Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Just before 8 p.m. on September 3, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton stood in her kitchen in Lakeland, Florida, staring into her cupboard. It was almost completely empty, except for a few cans of beans and a bag of flour. And seeing this gave Linda a pit in her stomach, because she knew she would somehow have to turn these sparse ingredients into a meal for her kids. Linda was a single mother of 2 boys, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And Linda didn't have very much money. And so in order to take care of her kids, she had to be resourceful. Like, finding a way to make food with whatever ingredients she had, and she also would make her kids their own clothing, anything to save money. Now, up until a few weeks ago, the family had lived in Alabama, but Linda had moved to Lakeland specifically because she had a lot of family and support there. And so Linda had hoped that, because of that support, that, her and her son's lives would, improve quite a bit, that it wouldn't feel like such a struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the move to Lakeland had just been more of the same. Linda couldn't find a steady job, so she and the boys had been relying on government assistance and food stamps, which never seemed to be enough to keep these 2 teenagers well fed. And tonight, Linda's youngest son, Tim, was about to be dropped off after being at football practice, and historically, he was very hungry after practice, and so she really wanted to have dinner ready for him. And on top of that, Linda was hopeful that Tim and her other son, Jeff, would eat fast enough that they would have enough time to make it to a neighbor's housewarming party later that night. So all the neighbors around Linda were basically as new as she was, since the complex they lived in had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was the sprawling development with about 80 one-story duplexes that were technically government-subsidized housing, but it felt more like classic suburbia, since the units were on cul-de-sacs with neat lawns where all the kids would go outside and play. Now, Linda's sister also lived in this complex, so Linda already knew at least one person. But to Linda, making friends of her own was also pretty important to her. She was an outgoing person by nature, and also she was newly single and wanted to take her mind off her ex-boyfriend. Until recently, Linda had been dating this guy named Brendan Fowler, who had been great at first and was even the one who told her about this apartment complex, but he'd started to get really controlling and possessive, and just 2 days ago, Linda had finally ended things. But believe it or not, Linda actually felt sort of hopeful. She had believed that by leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this complex, that would sort of be the refresh that she and her kids desperately needed. But the truth was, it sort of seemed like actually the true reset had been the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. Like it all needed to happen, all this big change in order for their lives to really get on the right track. And so, feeling optimistic, Linda looked into the cupboard at her limited ingredients and suddenly realized she could actually do a quick bean casserole with just these couple of things. So she grabbed the cans and the flour, and she got started. About a half an hour later, Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen to see if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but they needed to wait for Tim to get home from football first. And when she said that, Jeff sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and there was basically no food in the house, and so he couldn't even eat anything else to tide himself over, like, come on, let me eat. Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad, but at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. I mean, Jeff had been talking back to her a lot lately, and the two of them seemed to fight all the time. Linda knew he was sort of just being a typical teenager, and he was really hungry, and so he's testing her limits. But she was just getting really sick of it. And so before she could even really think about it, she snapped back at him and said, well, if you don't like it here, you can leave. And at that, Jeff literally stormed out of the house and slammed the door behind him. Linda went to the window and watched her son pick up his bike and pedal off down the road. After that, Linda sighed and walked over to her phone and called her mom. She assumed, Jeff, her son, would go to her parents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up, Linda warned her that Jeff might be there soon and he'd likely want to eat. Her mom said that was fine and they would drop him back off after dinner. Then her mom said she actually was glad that Linda called because another letter came. And as soon as Linda heard that, she felt this wave of anxiety come over her because she knew what kind of letter she was talking about. So Linda's ex-husband and Tim and Jeff's dad, Frank Slayton, lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they'd been divorced for 7 years. But Frank had never stopped harassing Linda after they broke up. And since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had been mailing threatening letters to Linda's parents, saying that Linda had ruined his life. And so now Linda was thinking, no matter how many fresh starts she started, that Frank was always going to screw them up. He was never going to go away. And so after taking a calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to read it. Not long after she hung up, her younger son, Tim, came in the front door. He was all sweaty and dirty from football practice, and right away, Linda asked him, "Hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home?" And Tim said, "Yes, I did." So Linda, she didn't have a car because she couldn't afford one, and so Tim's coach always had to give him a ride, but Tim said, "I thanked him like always." And so Linda told him to hurry up and eat because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim walked home from the party through the dark apartment complex. There were 7 other people who had been at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. Everybody just drank iced tea and played cards while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex, like the great business district across the street and how responsive the maintenance team was. So Linda was glad they went. She was also exhausted, and her sister always came over for coffee in the morning, so she needed to go to bed now or she would never wake up. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and opened up the door, Linda froze because there was already somebody inside. For a second, she thought it might be an intruder, but then she realized it was actually just her older son, Jeff, who had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a sort of "I'm sorry" expression on his face. Tim saw the situation and immediately disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and brother some space. Linda went to join Jeff in the kitchen, but Jeff didn't say anything. So Linda spoke first and reminded him that it was not good to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. And Linda knew from experience with her son, it was better not to force Jeff to talk. So she decided she would just give Jeff a minute, and she began washing the dishes. Finally, after a few moments, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom, and Linda smiled. She felt relieved they could just move on from this. She said it was all good and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight, and Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept, and then Linda wrapped up in the kitchen, turned off the lights, and headed into her own bedroom, closed the door, and she went to bed too. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up to Linda's duplex. They'd had coffee together every morning since they moved to the neighborhood, so Judy expected to knock on her sister's door and go right in like she always did. But this time after she knocked, nobody answered. So Judy waited and then knocked again. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and tried to open up the door, but she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out in response. But Judy wasn't really worried. She just assumed, that Linda must have overslept or something. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few minutes, and eventually she would call to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she walked away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's house. One of the back windows was missing a screen, and Judy knew that that particular room was Linda's bedroom, and it hadn't been like that yesterday. So seeing it now made her feel kind of uneasy, and so she went over to look inside. And when she looked inside, she saw her sister fast asleep in bed. And for a second, Judy was relieved, because this confirmed that this is all this was. Her sister had overslept, that's that. But then Judy realized there was something off about Linda, like the way she was positioned just seemed wrong. And when everything clicked for her, she staggered backwards and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on September 4th, 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers surrounded the duplex in a Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under some crime scene tape and headed to the home's walkway with a bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. So Pickett was actually just a year away from retirement after 2 decades as a detective, and for the last few years, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit, which meant he oversaw the collection and documentation of evidence at crime scenes. And so he wasn't the lead investigator on this case, but when it came to forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation and knew that this was very likely a homicide, and the victim had been identified as 31-year-old Linda Slayton. Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had asked a nearby maintenance worker to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responder got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep and appeared to have no idea their mother was deceased in the next room, which Pickett knew would give investigators somewhat of a timeline to start with. Linda was clearly awake when her kids went to sleep and must have died sometime during the night while her kids were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway, he passed by 2 teenage boys sitting in their pajamas on the ground. He assumed these must be the sons, and one of them just sort of stared ahead, seemingly in complete shock, while the other sort of sobbed into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if anybody had spoken to them yet, but he knew they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they'd know the habits and patterns of everybody who lived there, and might be able to tell him if anything seemed out of place. So Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators inside about that. Then he looked at the house and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of the crime scene before he did any actual collections. So before he would go in, he would walk around the entire house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the police first got there. And from what he could see, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and spent some time dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there, or any noticeable shoe impressions in the dirt outside. And then when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the officers and detectives that were already in there and went straight to the bedroom. And the first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed with a metal coat hanger wrapped around her throat. The sheets around her were covered in blood, and she was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up. And when Pickett got closer, he saw where the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches on Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her nails as she tried to pry the hanger away. He'd have to wait for the autopsy, but it was clear from her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also been likely sexually assaulted. Pickett stepped back and looked around the room, trying to decide where to start. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as possible. So the first thing he did was try and guess what happened and how the killer might have interacted with the crime scene. That way he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention. He figured the killer must have come in through the open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. Linda's purse and jewelry were still on the dresser, and the drawers were all closed as opposed to open and rifled through, so it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this likely was not a robbery gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done was come in through the window and attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any signs of a struggle. So Linda was likely caught off guard by a very fast attack and unable to really fight back quickly, because if she did, the room would be a huge mess. But then Pickett caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed the clothes were all hanging on metal hangers that looked identical to the one that was around Linda's neck. And that's when it hit him. The killer must have at some point been in the closet, hiding. He supposed the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger once the attack started, but that would have taken too much time and also given Linda a chance to get off the bed or fight back or yell out and maybe wake her sons up. It was much more likely that the killer had broken in earlier, hid in the closet, and then waited until Linda was in her bed asleep to come out and attack. If Pickett was right about that, This became definitely a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or had been watching her, since they would have known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear and began thinking how he was going to begin looking for evidence. He figured he would start at the window and spend some time there, and then he would go to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas. And so once he had that plan in mind, he went to the window and he began looking for evidence, and sure enough, after only a few minutes of dusting, he smiled. Because there, on the ledge, was a very clear, well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab, comparing two sets of prints with a magnifying glass. He'd been at it for hours already, so his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene yesterday, Pickett had gone back to the station to review the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the detectives to get an update on the case. And what they would tell him is they had spoken to the neighbors, as well as Linda's family, and they did have a few solid leads and a timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff got dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. And Tim, the younger son, and Linda had gotten back from a neighbor's party just after 11 p.m. They all went to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers heard anything until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene, that Linda's attack was very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or it would have woken up her sons. The autopsy report had also come in, and it confirmed Linda died from strangulation and was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect semen from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a man here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners. She had her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and an ex-boyfriend named Brendan Fowler. Frank apparently had abused Linda when they were married and still sent her very threatening letters. And Brendan was apparently very possessive with a bad temper, and Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. And so some officers were already out looking for both of these men, and Pickett was eager to get both of their prints. But for now, Pickett was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their canvass initially, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were suspects. And so Pickett had collected fingerprints from all the men at that party who didn't have an alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, comparing those prints to the print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none were a match, but they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, and so Pickett would have to test those as well. So in 1981, DNA testing didn't exist yet, but investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those samples against the genetic material found on Linda's body and rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another reason for wanting to be diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because after Linda's murder, like in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors had called in to say a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was gone by the time the police arrived, they could see her back door had clearly been forced open. And then another neighbor had called in to say that the screen on their window was pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like Linda's, but the timing was very suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living in the complex. The department had ordered some patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about. So he was working with his radio right next to him. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty tired and would need a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting, because they just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing outside of an interrogation room, listening as some detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell by his voice that he was not happy to be here. He sounded argumentative and defensive, as he insisted he really had nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the whole night. He even gave detectives his mom's phone number and said they should call her to confirm it. Pickett heard the detectives confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test and let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, "Yeah, go ahead." And as soon as Pickett heard that, based on experience, he went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind. On September 11th, so 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the newspaper, and what he saw made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he admitted they would not be making an arrest now or in the next few days. And reading that in print reminded Pickett of just how little they had in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill, and they'd tracked down Linda's ex-husband Frank, but found that he was in Alabama on the night Linda was killed. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first because during his polygraph, the results had been inconclusive, and his alibi didn't check out. His family had said he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they all went to sleep and couldn't say for sure if maybe he left or not. But when Pickett had looked at his prints, he had no choice but to clear him, because they clearly were not a match. So now Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for leads, which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his paper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him, and it was Linda's own 15-year-old son, Jeff Slayton, and he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his mother's murder, and had already been questioned a few times. Detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members mentioned that, Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot before she died. And when investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's room. So it was strange he hadn't heard anything on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that he and his mother's fights were not that serious, and they did fight the night she died, but it was over some dumb argument over what time dinner was. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked, because he wished he had so he could have gone in there and helped her. And also Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff, and Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid, because he thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own, and from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed sort of like typical teenage behavior, squabbling with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker broke in through the window, which didn't make sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he lifted from the window, and he knew it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, partner, or friend, which was why he assumed the detectives weren't pursuing it. But through his forensics, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everybody in Linda's life who had a motive or opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was very outgoing. Pickett thought it was possible the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed possible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave, he tried to go back to the newspaper, but he kept thinking about Linda. He'd been sure this case would be solved quickly by forensics, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed, and it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he left the precinct for the last time, he sort of had a pit in his stomach, because he had a feeling that without him, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, so 2 decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, Detective Brad Grice sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department reading over Linda's cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grice had been sorting through the department's cold cases and choosing which ones to reopen. And this had been a really slow process, because he had to do that and juggle his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been working on Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much, since the whole reason this case appealed to him was because he was sure he could solve it quickly. Because it had DNA evidence. So back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through blood type. But now, in 2001, Grice could use that same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. And he intended on reaching out to everybody involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did this, he wanted to familiarize himself with the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters around the time of her murder. And then her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, was known to have a bad temper and seemed very controlling of Linda. And they broke up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so somebody could have maybe followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been too, but Jeff actually admitted to getting in a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared through fingerprints, alibi, or polygraphs. But Grice knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those 3 things, DNA overrode that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He'd already decided that, basically no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the 2 people who'd known Linda better than anybody else. Her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grice walked into a meeting room at the precinct where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting. And as soon as he saw the brothers, he just started laughing because he realized he knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together for years, but it hadn't occurred to Grice that this Jeff was that Jeff. And Jeff recognized Grice at the same time. So they spent a while talking and laughing about what a crazy coincidence this was. And so when Grice finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim at the same time, Grice's first line of questioning was actually just pretty emotional. It just was like, hey, how are you guys holding up after this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood got pretty heavy as the 2 brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been. After their mother had been killed, they both said they were terrified that, they were going to get hurt too, because the killer was never caught. They felt like, who's next? Jeff said he slept with a knife under his pillow, and he eventually got so depressed, he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted he also struggled, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and friends for support and kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grice that, Tim and Jeff didn't really have any information he didn't already have inside the case file. So instead of continuing to question them about details of the case, Grice explained that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect samples from every person involved in this case, which included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then said, of course. So Grice stood up and said he would send a tech inside. But before he left, he promised them that he would find their mom's killer, and he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grice sat in front of a screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the 2 Slayton brothers, Grice had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case from 1981. Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband Frank Slayton and her ex-boyfriend Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the blood samples that the original investigators got from Linda's neighbors, but none of them matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer, which was disappointing because it meant that Grice had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the case notes, he noticed the mention of break-ins around the complex shortly after Linda's murder, and it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person would not have just hurt Linda, they would have other victims too. So Grice had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases that, felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. So in 1982, a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Ulmer was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window, then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had this long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grice finished reading the report, he jumped up and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on Jimmy as he possibly could, and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grice sat at his desk, staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important call, one that would confirm whether Jimmy Ulmer was Linda's killer. After doing a background check on Jimmy, Grice had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex and was literally staying with them when Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy was not alive anymore, but they had gotten in touch with his mother, who gave them her DNA, which they were testing now. So this DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, but it would show if she was at least a relative to the killer. And as Grice waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding, because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally made sense now. Jimmy was this violent serial home invader who had probably seen Linda while staying at his friend's house and maybe stalked her until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes to find more victims. Just then the phone rang, and Grice picked it up, and he could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other side. He was going to get an answer here. But just a second later, they told him it was not a match. Grice's stomach dropped, but he thanked them anyway, and he hung up. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grice kept pushing forward. As the months passed by, he would regularly find new suspects and eventually clear them. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database in case any new additions were, added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grice still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline, and he finally had to make the call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone and dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grice said he did need to retire, and he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into retirement, Grice sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep in an article when his cell phone rang. And when he looked at the ID, he was surprised to see it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He had not gotten a call from them in years, so he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grice was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on the DNA profile that Grice had ordered. And through that process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they did, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints did match the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grice sat up and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. That suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out, the killer had removed that screen from her bedroom window and crept inside. And then they had hid in this closet until she had come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now and finding ways to get close to her and her family. But Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark closet, holding their breath as their heart pounded, and as they listened to Linda open her bedroom door and walk inside. And the killer continued to wait anxiously as they listened to the sound of Linda getting ready for bed and getting changed, and then eventually they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then after the killer was sure Linda was in bed, the lights are off, it's quiet in the room, they waited even longer just to make sure Linda was asleep and her children were asleep. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they grabbed a coat hanger off the hook in the closet and then burst out of the door. And then before Linda could do anything, make a sound, even react, she's totally caught off guard, the killer was on top of her and had wrapped the coat hanger around her throat. Linda struggled and clawed at her throat to try to get this thing off of her, but the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda, and then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was done, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through and wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life and would drive him to and from practice every day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently just developed a total fixation on his mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning out how and when to attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph was interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder, but he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice, and Tim would even very tragically begin to rely on Joseph for, emotional support, grieving the loss of his mother, but it's to her killer. He just didn't know. And then even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row in that picture. In December of 2019, Joseph was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery and was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. On the night of March 2nd, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Pucheta rode his motorcycle down a dirt road in rural Argentina. It was pitch black out with no streetlights, and on either side of the road were mostly open fields, interspersed with patches of forest, and there were mountains rising up in the background. There was nobody around him for miles. This was an area called La Pampa, and it was famous for its beautiful landscapes and cowboy culture. Sergio was out here patrolling for poachers, who came out here at night to trap or kill the wild cats, monkeys, and birds that often sold for lots of money on the black market. It had been a quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from experience that the later it got, the more likely it would be that he would catch someone doing something illegal. At around 10 p.m., Sergio was riding down the road towards a crossroads that locals called El Cruce de las Cañas, and up ahead, he saw the red taillights of a car. And at first, it seemed like this car was coming to a stop, but then it turned off the road and drove into this nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation about the size of a football field, and then these taillights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart start to beat a bit faster because he knew this had to be a poacher. Maybe, he thought, this poacher had seen him and realized he could be a cop and so was driving off the road and basically trying to hide from Sergio. Sergio sped up on his motorcycle, and when he reached the spot where this car had left the road, he pulled over and he parked. Sergio climbed off his bike and then radioed into headquarters his location and asked for backup. Then he unholstered his gun. He knew this far out, it was going to take backup a long time to get here, and Sergio had no intentions of letting these poachers get away. Sergio had a flashlight, but he didn't bother to take it out because he didn't want to give away his position. But in the darkness, Sergio was having a really hard time finding where in this vegetation the car had gone. There were no broken branches or crushed bushes. I mean, the entire vegetation looked completely uniform and intact. And so Sergio, with his gun drawn in front of him, began pacing along the shoulder of this road looking for tire tracks on the ground. But after looking for a while, he couldn't find any. Like there was no indication that a car was ever here or drove into this vegetation. And so eventually, Sergio just stopped and listened. He figured the poachers could only have driven a little ways into the trees before stopping, and so he hoped to hear them moving around. But as he stood there, all he could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crickets and cicadas chirping and buzzing, the hoots of owls, and the long, strange chirring sound of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew if he wanted to catch these poachers, he couldn't just sit here all night hoping they made a noise. So he took a deep breath, stepped off the road, and made his way into the trees. He walked quickly but carefully, moving branches aside with one hand and holding his gun with the other, constantly scanning left and right for any movement or light. And when he was about 100 feet into the trees, he finally saw something. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glint in the darkness. And for a second, it almost looked like moonlight reflecting off of something metal. And so Sergio thought, that's got to be the car. I've caught them. They're right here. But when Sergio turned to face them, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw was so jarring, so terrifying that for a second, he just stood there frozen to the spot. And as he did, the sounds in the forest began to amplify all around him, and he felt this panic building inside of his chest. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. A few minutes later, an off-duty police officer who was friendly with Sergio was heading to bed in his home when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling him, so he opened his phone and said hello. But Sergio didn't say hello back. Instead, in a voice that was unusually cold and monotone, Sergio just said, "Come to Las Cañas. You know what to do." And before this other officer could ask Sergio what he meant, what's going on here, the line just went dead. The officer tried to call Sergio back, but Sergio didn't answer. The officer really had no idea what was going on here. This was exceptionally odd behavior by Sergio. And so this officer felt compelled to call it into headquarters just in case. But when this officer got the dispatcher on the phone, the dispatcher told him they actually already had backup on their way to Sergio right now. And the dispatcher told him that they were actually pretty worried about Sergio too. Because after Sergio's first radio call had come in where he gave his location and asked for backup, they had lost contact with him. Every time they had tried to call him back, he wasn't answering. Meanwhile, the backup, 3 police cars full of officers, sped past cornfields into the remote area that contained Las Cañas, where Sergio had last been. And when they got to the actual spot on the road where Sergio had said he was, like his actual location, they found his motorcycle, but Sergio was nowhere to be found, and nobody else was there either. It was just this motorcycle. And so the 3 cars pulled over near the motorcycle, and the officers got out. One of the officers tried again to hail Sergio on the radio, but again they were met with silence. And so they all fanned out with their flashlights and began searching this road up and down, looking for any sign of Sergio. And after a minute or two, one of the officers spotted this cluster of metal in the sand by the side of the road. Now, this officer did not immediately connect whatever this metal was with whatever happened to Sergio. They just walked over to see what it was. But when he actually reached it and shone his light directly on it, he gasped and called out to the other officers, "Over here!" Because these pieces of metal definitely had something to do with Sergio. They were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. This discovery immediately launched a major police search operation. More backup poured into Las Cañas, and officers teamed up and continued to search the area. And pretty quickly, officers found what looked like Sergio's footprints heading away from the road and into the cluster of trees. So the officers began to follow them. However, after getting about 100 feet into the trees following these footsteps, they noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting further and further apart. At first, the officers thought, okay, well, maybe Sergio began sprinting and taking really big, long strides. But as they continued following these steps through the trees and out the backside into this big field, the distance between these steps continued to get bigger and bigger until finally the gap from one step to the next was 10 feet apart, then 15 feet apart, and then 20 feet apart. I mean, even if Sergio had been sprinting at full speed and literally leaping, this was too big of a distance to cover. I mean, this was literally humanly impossible. The police officers following these prints looked at each other uneasily. Each footprint was perfectly clear. There was no mistaking this was a human footprint. And then also, they were certain they were not missing prints in between the ones they could see. They really were spaced this far apart. The officers had been talking to each other when they began following these prints. But now they just walked in silence. For more than 1 mile, they tracked Sergio's bizarre, seemingly impossible trail through open fields and trees until they arrived at a cornfield. And then suddenly, the trail of footprints just stopped. It was like Sergio had pushed off his right foot and then just vanished. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. In 2017, I left the military after 7 years, and I knew reintegrating into civilian life was going to be a challenge, but I was not prepared for just how much of a challenge it would be. When you're in the military, it's like you're sort of in a bubble. It's its own world. And so once I was out of that bubble in the real world again, I was shocked by just how much I didn't know how to do. I didn't know how to use new technology. I didn't know how to find a good job. I didn't even know what a good job was. Like, the jobs themselves were confusing. And on top of all that, I was struggling with really dark, intrusive thoughts that were making my life kind of a living nightmare. However, instead of sharing this with anybody, I just held it in, and it only made my issues worse. Luckily, my family noticed I was really struggling, and they stepped in and they encouraged me to seek out help with a therapist. And I took their advice, and honestly, I don't know if I would be here if I hadn't. So if you're really struggling right now and you're kind of holding everything in, you really ought to consider giving therapy a shot. And one of the most accessible therapy platforms out there is BetterHelp, and they're on a mission to make starting therapy easier. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire online, and then you'll be matched with a therapist in as few as a couple of days. And if that therapist is not a good fit for you, you can easily switch to another one who is at no additional cost. BetterHelp makes sure all their therapists are well qualified, and their customer support team is always there to help you. So if you're struggling and think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. The search for Sergio went on all night, despite the fact that it started to pour at around 2 a.m. But the officers never gave up. However, beyond those footsteps, they never found any other trace of Sergio. And there was one other thing police couldn't find. There was absolutely no sign of the poachers that Sergio had called in before he had vanished. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. There was no broken vegetation or anything like that. It looked like no car had ever been driven into these trees. And there were no signs of any kind of struggle either that would explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. The whole situation just made absolutely no sense. At 4:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2006, so roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared, a farmer was walking on his property about 12 miles away from Las Cañas when he looked up ahead and he saw this dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look, and the figure looked like a man, but he was all curled up into a ball and he was sitting in the mud. Now, keep in mind, this area is like in the middle of nowhere, and so this farmer did not get a lot of people passing through the area, and so to see anybody was pretty rare, let alone what he was seeing now. And so, feeling curious, the farmer called out to this man, but didn't get a response, and so he just started walking towards him. And when he got up close, he saw this man was a police officer in full uniform. He had his knees pulled up to his chest with his arms wrapped around him, and his head was buried in his lap, and so the farmer couldn't see his face. And weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped raining, and the ground that the officer was sitting on was still wet, this man was totally dry. The farmer leaned down and gently put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Sir, are you okay?" But the officer didn't react at all. He just stayed there motionless, head in his lap, not reacting, totally silent. And this was just too strange. The farmer backed away, took out his phone, and he called the police. It didn't take long for the police to show up and identify this seated police officer as Sergio Pucheta. But Sergio wouldn't talk to the police any more than he would speak to the farmer. He didn't appear to be physically injured, but there was definitely something wrong with him. So the officers called an ambulance, and they summoned Sergio's boss to see if he could get Sergio to respond. And when Sergio's boss showed up, he was able to coax Sergio up off the ground, but still Sergio wouldn't speak. All he would do is give his boss a big hug and just break down and cry. So his boss led Sergio over to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and he got him in the back, and he sat with him, and then went with Sergio to the hospital and followed him into his exam room. At first, inside the exam room, Sergio didn't want anybody to touch him, and he was very anxious, and he kept squinting and grimacing every time the lights were put on him. But after a few minutes, he did let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Sergio's boss had expected that Sergio would have injuries. I mean, he figured he had likely been assaulted or kidnapped. But as he watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was very clear that Sergio did not have any injuries. There were no bruises, no cuts, no sign of any physical struggle at all. And not only that, as the nurse took Sergio's vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick at all, despite the fact he had just been missing for 18 hours with no supplies. The only injury the medical team did find on Sergio was to his feet, but it did not help clarify anything. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found these bizarre burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he'd been standing on a hot surface. Over the next couple of hours, Sergio did finally begin to talk. And here is the totally wild story that he told. At 10 p.m. the night before, when Sergio had followed the poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car reflecting the moonlight. However, he didn't. There was no car. There were no poachers. When he turned, all he saw in the darkness were two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him. Sergio stood there stunned, unsure who or what these eyes belonged to. And then before he could do anything, the eyes began to move closer to him. And as they did, Sergio realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes, these were not animal eyes. These eyes belonged to some creature he had never seen before. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were these slim gray bodies with big heads and long skinny fingers, and they didn't appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but when he did, no sound came out. And that's when Sergio realized that not only could he not scream, but he no longer was able to move. But then suddenly he felt this intense pressure in his torso, and his back sort of involuntarily arched in response. He tried to wrench himself free of whatever seemed to be in control of him, but he couldn't. It felt like his spine was going to snap. And then he felt himself begin to walk out of the forest backwards, like his back is arched in this totally unnatural position, and he's marching out of the trees. And then as he's doing this, he watched helplessly as one of his hands went down and pulled out his phone. And then he dialed the number of that officer, and then this detached, cold voice came out of Sergio's mouth, telling his friend, "Come to Las Cañas, you know what to do." And as Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre bent-over gait, he felt himself reach for his gun. And after he drew it, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassemble it and drop the pieces on the ground. And then he watched himself do the exact same thing with his radio. And the whole time, these red-eyed creatures are just a few feet away, staring at him. It was only after Sergio had disarmed himself that he felt that intense pressure on him subside, and he realized this was his chance to escape. He took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind and he pitched forward. He thought he was falling, but he didn't hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was being lifted up into the sky, and for a moment, he just careened through the air until abruptly, whatever force was holding him up let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet, but then once again, he was lifted back up. And this time, he was thrown even farther through the air before he hit the ground. And then it happened again, and again, and again. And so as this was happening, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be the ones in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape, but they didn't stop him. They just kept picking him up and throwing him forward over and over again. And as all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. The last thing he remembered was running through a cornfield, and as he did, he realized suddenly that it seemed like he was all alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. And so Sergio looked over his shoulder, and all he saw were swaying corn stalks and darkness, and for a moment he's thinking, maybe this is all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. And then, once again, he felt himself begin to rise into the air, and he looked down into this darkness, into this void, and staring back at him are two red glowing eyes. After that, Sergio passed out, and he had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio, including Sergio himself. But it should be noted that Argentina and South America more broadly is a very well-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Following this incident, Sergio was so traumatized that he retired from the police force. To this day, cops and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around Las Cañas.